there might, maybe, I don't know if you can relate, been a time in my life when I argued with strangers on the internet about religion. I don't do that anymore. There's not much point to it. But I remember specifically back in 2008, the marriage equality, same-sex marriage debate was going on. There was going to be a vote about Prop 8. My husband and I went to the courthouse while his mother was in hospice, and we had an emergency wedding in Santa Ana because we were worried that the right to get married would be taken away, which it was the following week, actually. So I was a little angry sometimes. And I would get on the internet and state my case with people, and what I noticed is a lot of people who were against marriage equality were coming from a religious perspective. And that made me a little angry too. I grew up going to a Christian church, but at this point in my life I thought, how can they believe this stuff? And how can they believe this stuff to such a degree that they're trying to trample on the rights of others? So I was over it. I was over church. I was over faith communities. I was over all that nonsense. And yet, there was a tension there. Because I had grown up in a Christian church where the minister was a man named Reverend David Kagawada. Now, Reverend Kagawada had, as a child, actually lived in Pasadena. This was Indiana that I grew up in, but he had lived in Pasadena, and he was interned in a concentration camp, as was his family at that time. So this man had every reason to be bitter and angry and everything else, and yet he was so incredibly compassionate. He so believed in justice and helping other people, and that was the message I grew up in that sense of community and belonging. And so I carried that with me. And at the same time, I was so angry at these religious communities, and I couldn't quite reconcile that. And then, of course, one fateful Sunday morning, I showed up with Lawrence at a UU church, and, well, I guess you know the rest of the story, right? And yet still, in the last few years, have we seen that rise of Christian nationalism in this country. I've had that sense of unease. Certainly working with people of various faiths over the years in social justice work as a UU, I've encountered plenty of people of all kinds of faiths, including different Christian denominations who we were working solidly with, and I thought that had healed whatever that was in me, but it was still there. And then I went to Minneapolis. So I want to tell you about 3 Christian churches in Minneapolis this morning that helped to heal my soul and teach me a little something about radical love that makes me feel even more affirmed in my identity as a Unitarian Universalist. The first church was the Westminster Presbyterian Church. We clergy had been called to Minneapolis from all over the country, and we knew there were 700 to 1,000 of us showing up. We've been vetted to get into this encrypted system where we were getting messages, and we were told, we can't tell you in advance where we will be. I'm not even sure they knew. I mean, this was all organized in a matter of days, but we can't tell you until the last minute, but just come to Minneapolis. So the night before, we got a message that we would be at Westminster Presbyterian in downtown Minneapolis. We weren't allowed to tell anyone until 24 hours after our gathering. The gathering was supposed to be as much of a secret as it could be because we didn't know what might happen if the word got out. So the first thing I thought about this congregation was that they were taking a real risk. This great big church in downtown Minneapolis, taking a real risk by hosting this event, by having all of these people come there when ICE agents are all over downtown Minneapolis, when the city is occupied by the federal government, they were making themselves a target. The second thing I learned and experienced about Westminster Presbyterian was that as I came into the building, I clearly looked like I needed help from the cold, because people from behind the desk got out and came over to me and said, "Let's light the fireplace for you." There were tables lined up in that entry area, tables and tables full of winter clothing, coats and hats and gloves and boots and pants for people to wear, things that had been donated for this event. Again, just in a matter of days. And the hospitality we experienced in that space was so warm, so welcoming. As people from that faith community got into the pulpit, as we were all gathered in that large sanctuary, I didn't hear a single person say something that felt like I wasn't included in it. There was no theological idea or assumption that we all believe the same thing on some level, other than the fact that we were all there with the idea of how can we help protect people. That was the unifying humanistic idea that brought all these faith traditions and this Presbyterian congregation to host us. At the table for breakfast that morning were two UUs, a Buddhist, two rabbis, and a Roman Catholic. This is not a joke. But we're all there around that table. And again, I'm sitting there with a Roman Catholic and Buddhist and so on, and we're just talking about how we can come together so we can protect people. So during that time there, we started to talk about what we would be doing. We talked about the action that would be taken at the airport, where we knew that people would be arrested, and sure enough, 100 clergy were arrested at the airport. We talked about the protest that would be done at Target. We talked about protests that would be done at other organizations around town. And we started to divide into different rooms once we knew what the options were on what we could do. And as we are milling about in this huge church, again, 700 of us, the alarm goes off. And a voice over the intercom says, "Please evacuate the building immediately." Now, I learned something about clergy. We're actually cool under stress. Nobody ran, nobody pushed, nobody shoved. We just gently, carefully started moving toward the exits. And I know through all of our heads at that moment, it was flashing, what was going on? What had happened? Why were we evacuating the building? Had we been discovered? Were there ICE agents waiting for us? Had they come into the building? We didn't know. And then within a minute or so of that alarm going off, another message came over the intercom. "Everyone, just stay exactly where you are." And again, we obeyed. Clergy can be obedient in those moments. And after another minute or so of these questions going through all of our heads, we got the announcement that it was a false alarm. Somebody had driven into the parking garage entrance and set off a whole bunch of security alarms. Everything was fine. But in those moments, the risk that this church had taken in having us there was all running through our heads. What might happen to us, what might be going on, and what they had sacrificed by being willing to host us in this particular moment in time. That's love, folks. That's love. That's the driver of that radical love we're talking about this morning. The next church I want to tell you about is one called Calvary Lutheran Church. Now, this is the church that is located just a few steps from where George Floyd was killed by a police officer about 5-6 years ago. And when we walked into this church, it's an old Gothic traditional style church with these beautiful stained glass windows, but in the sanctuary, it was all set up with little tables like a cafe and a long coffee and espresso bar down one side of the sanctuary. And I thought, what's up with this? I got the answer a little bit later. But what we learned about this church is that when George Floyd was killed, this church became the organizing hub. This is where protests and vigils and resistance actions were organized inside this space. This is where people came to find community, to connect and reconnect with one another, and then go out and do that resistance work. And they had such an outpouring of support for this work they were doing that for the very first protest, they asked people if they could bring some snacks and drinks, and they were so overwhelmed with that they had to dedicate an entire room in that building to housing all of those snacks and drinks, and that became what they called the community table. And for the years that continued on of this resistance work, these protests, these demonstrations, people out in the street, barricading the streets and holding their neighborhood with care, this community table was always there to provide drinks and food for those folks. And then along the way, this church realized that it was truly a neighborhood church. And like so many churches these days, it tried to figure out what did it mean to be sustainable going forward. And what they realized it meant for them was to actually sell the building to a developer who had agreed to deeply affordable housing for people in that neighborhood, and then rent back the space that the church needed to the church. So there we were in that building that now had dozens of people living in it. And the reason the sanctuary looked so strange when we were there midweek is because it is a community center midweek as opposed to a sanctuary. And this, they felt like, was their way of truly honoring the fact that they were a community center. They were choosing neighbors over ownership. There's a quote from Sherry Seifert, who works with racial justice there, and she said, "This experience of losing our walls and having permeable boundaries with the neighborhood allowed us to be the church we were always meant to be." They thought outside the box. They grounded themselves in love. They made this choice not out of some abstract ideology, not out of force or ownership, but out of community and radical love. Again, my heart healed just a little bit by being in that space. The next church we visited was a place called St. Paul's San Pablo, and it's also a Lutheran church. It's 139 years old. It was started by Swedish immigrants, and it is located in what is considered the most diverse area of Minneapolis. They believe that there are over 60 languages spoken in this neighborhood. 60 languages. And this community, this congregation is made up of people who are mostly immigrants. And this is a place that was able to move nimbly and quickly when there was need. When I walked into the building, in the social hall, there were tables all across the social hall, and they had brown bags that were being filled by people, filled with food. And I asked about what this was, and they said that when ICE had surged upon the city, the church had responded in a matter of hours. People had figured out a food distribution center because all of a sudden, most of that congregation was afraid to leave their houses and get groceries. And not just that congregation, but the people living in that area, because ICE is crawling all over that area, as you can imagine. And so they'd set up this food distribution center, and they had people coming in, people from their congregation, people from other places, other congregations, or people from no congregations at all who were taking routes and delivering food on a regular basis to people who needed it. But not just that. This congregation had opened its doors. Children afraid to go to school, so they were coming to the church to have something that felt like school. People who needed help with their medical questions, needed legal help, needed people to accompany them for prescriptions or pick up prescriptions for them because, again, they were too scared to leave their house. So many things that they were doing. They were even offering free acupuncture to stressed out community leaders there in that sanctuary. I mean, talk about thinking outside the box, right? Talk about grounding yourselves in love. I came into that building, I discovered something. So lace-up boots that in California are just fine do not cut it in Minnesota snow. So the first day I was there, I'd had leaky boots and very cold feet. And so I came to them with my problem, and they were so kind. I had a whole group of people in the kitchen that were finding me plastic bags to put over my socks and to make sure my feet were warm and so on. But again, that sense of no one trying to push a theology on anybody else, but people who really see their participation in a faith community as being about how do we help other people in the world. Really a beautiful, beautiful thing to see. And we got a quote from that, from the minister there, Harold Osorto. And he was talking about the fact that ICE has been all over this neighborhood and how frightened people have been to leave their homes. And he says, my resistance is showing up on a Sunday morning and continuing to insist that this is a space that is sacred. This is a space that is a sanctuary. And whether or not the government chooses to honor that role, we will continue to insist on making sure that it exists for our people. We went on a bus pilgrimage from that church. And when we came back and we were inside the building, we were then told that ICE had surrounded the building. And again, there was that sense of what's going to happen. And so we sang, and we were together, and eventually they left. It was an intimidation tactic. But what a place to be in that moment, to be in community with people, and to recognize, here I am just a visitor experiencing this anxiety and uncertainty, and these are folks dealing with this right on their streets every single day. So the question is, why Minneapolis? Is it just random? No. The people in Minneapolis know why they were chosen for this, and they know that they were chosen for specific reasons, and they know that this was serving as a testing ground. They know that they had rejected the current president through voting 3 times. They know that Minneapolis is a refuge for immigrants, trans folks, people seeking reproductive freedom. They know that Minneapolis is a place where there is a strong, formalized social safety net, and also these informal networks that are thriving there. They know that it is a place with a high voter turnout, with deep civic engagement. It's a place with the largest Somali population outside of Somalia, a place of multiculturalism and diversity, a place known worldwide after George Floyd specifically for justice movements. So Minneapolis was ready for this test, because when those ICE agents surged on the city, they mobilized immediately. Mobilized, supported by congregations like the three I talked about today, and all kinds of other faith communities across the board were there. Certainly the UU congregation in that area, Jewish congregations, they were all part of helping to respond to what was happening with ICE. And they were doing things like tracking those agents right from the start, and delivering groceries, dropping off homework, organizing rent funds for people because they couldn't get out and work, so they couldn't pay their rent. So much needed to be done, and that community infrastructure was activated immediately. I told you about the wonderful Marcia Howard, the school teacher who during the George Floyd protests, she was actually one of the ones who created the protest by, she said, stepping outside her house, and they started barricading the streets, and then Marcia led that huge 50 to 100,000 person march on downtown Minneapolis while we were there that week. But Marcia Howard said of the federal government, they hate us because we don't hate each other. They hate us because we don't hate each other. And if anything, what you feel there in these networks of people who are so different, who've come together, is love. That's what's holding that community, that city together. It was targeted not because it is weak, but because it models something authoritarianism cannot tolerate. Neighbors who refuse to turn on one another. An authoritarian regime can't survive that. That's radical love. And guess what, folks? Thank goodness the sermon is today and it wasn't Wednesday, because on Thursday we heard that surge is leaving. The government has its explanation of why they're stepping out, but we know why. It was controversial, there was backlash, and the people resisted. And now they're getting out of there. It's not over, but that concentration of ICE on that city will be going. This is a victory for the moment, and we know the fight continues on, but look at what love was able to do. People banding together and resisting and connecting and offering community and care. And evil says, I don't want to be there. I want to go. These churches, congregations, faith communities reminded me again of what this is all about. Sometimes I need reminding too. And it made me realize that if Christian nationalism says protect our power, these churches are saying protect our neighbors. If nationalism says let's build walls, these congregations are saying let's build networks. And if nationalism claims land and property, these congregations are saying let's share it. And those are radical messages grounded in radical love at this moment in time. It shouldn't be so radical, right? But it is. It's countercultural right now. This idea that we choose people over power, or that we take risks without guarantees, or that we offer mutual care, or that we relinquish control when appropriate. None of this is what we're seeing in the larger dominant forces at work. But my goodness, is this not powerful as resistance? These are folks who are showing up in this moment. Last week I told you about a young woman who stood up on that fist sculpture in the middle of George Floyd Square, and she looked at us there and she said, "Don't forget us. Don't forget us." And the whole time I was there, people were so excited that people had shown up in the city to offer care. I can't tell you how affirmed they felt by people being there. Don't ever underestimate that. And we're not going to underestimate that this morning because you have cards. And if you don't have a card and pen, I invite you to raise your hand and one of our ushers will bring it to you. But a card and pen this morning. And what I would like us all to do is take a moment and write an expression of gratitude or solidarity or affirmation to these communities in Minneapolis. And I will send these in a box to some of my contacts there, and they're going to pass them out to people who are doing this work. And I want you to sign it with your name, if you're comfortable, and Tapestry UU in California. And this will be a way of letting them know that not only are they not alone, but that we are there alongside them doing this work. And when you're done filling out your card, you can put it in this basket. I know you may not finish it right at this moment, and that's absolutely fine. The basket will be up here at the end of the service for you to put your card in. But we're going to have a moment of musical meditation that Irene, our wonderful music director, will play for us. And I invite you to just say what's on your heart to the folks there in Minneapolis and let them know they are not alone and they are appreciated for what they have done.